Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going to share some easy floral card ideas with the new Petal Poetry Collection from Crafty Meraki. There is a beautiful stamp set, a press plate set, as well as a coordinating die set to cut out both the stamp and press plate images. And then there is a layering stencil set. I always love when press plates and stamps come with layering stencil sets because it makes it so easy to color them in and give you some more opportunities. I'm going to start with the press plate set, and I'm going to use it with my glimmer system, and I'm going to foil it with some Prism Glimmer foil. Now, the Prism Glimmer foil is silver, but it has a beautiful holographic shine, and it's one of my favorites to use because no matter what color you use with it, it works really, really well, and those colors from that foil play off of the colors you use in the florals. So I have my hot glimmer system. I had my plate on there. I put the pretty side of the foil face down on touching the plate, and then I'm foiling on Hammermill Cardstock. Once the timer has gone off, I put it through my Platinum 6 machine, and then I peel the foil off and reveal the image. I always solid hot foil my images at the same time, and here I am going to use it in the card. If I don't use it in the card, I'll often use it for future projects or do some die cutting with it. But we might as well utilize the excess of that foil. For my first card, I'm going to use that layering stencil to color in my images. Because my piece of Hammermill cardstock is 8.5 by 5.5 here, there's not enough room for that stencil to stick on my sticky mat, so I'm just using some painter's tape to hold it in place. Any tape will do. Because these are going to be die cut, it doesn't need to be anything special at all. I don't worry about whether I am staying within the stenciled lines at all or within the stencils themselves with my ink. I'm more concerned with what the florals themselves look like. So I started off with some shaded lilac distress ink, and I tried to do an even coat, but even when you're doing an even coat with them, you're going to get a little bit of buildup around the edges. When I'm doing my ink blending, like to make sure that I'm going both clockwise and counterclockwise in order to try to make it fairly even. For my second layer, I'm going to use an interference pad, and the one that I'm going to use for this layer is Lavender Fields. I always love playing around with the interference properties of these pads. So for this card, these cards, I'm going to use the Hickory Smoke, and I'm using a detailed blending brush, just doing a little bit of shading in the center of that flower and a few of the folds from the petals that fold forward. This is going to show off some of the interference colors to it, and it's also going to give it some extra drama and just some really interesting looks, and I love the final result of these. Once I'm done using that Hickory Smoke Distress ink, I'm using a microfiber cloth just to wipe off any ink that might be on that stencil. I don't want to contaminate my pads in any way, so I always am sure to wipe that stencil off. Then I'm using another ink blending brush with my Lavender Fields pads and doing an even coat all the way around. Now, my pads, I use them often, so they're not super juicy. So I will dot off my blending brush on my stencil before I start blending into the open areas of the stencil, just to kind of get a feel of how much ink I have on that stencil. If it's really juicy, I will do that often. As I'm getting comfortable with how much ink I'm getting on my brush, if I find that I don't have a whole lot of ink, I will just go straight into those open areas. For the next layer, I use the crushed velvet interference ink. For this one, there is a lot smaller areas, and most of those areas already have that hickory smoke underneath them from the second layer of my stencil. So I don't repeat that process. I just go right in with that interference color using a separate brush. I always use separate brushes for my different interference ink pads. That way I don't have any contamination between them. For the leaves, my first layer is going to be Bundled Sage Distress ink. And you can see as I'm doing my ink blending, I'm going both clockwise and counterclockwise. I am trying to do some ink on all of the open areas, but I'm being heavier towards the base of each leaf. I want to have some natural shading there, and by being heavier handed towards the base of that leaf, I can easily accomplish that. If you prefer, you can have just an even coat of ink over your whole that whole stencil piece, but I really like when you have some lighter areas and darker areas. And it's easy to accomplish by just being heavier handed or lighter handed with your blending brush. For my last layer here, I am going to use the Summer Garden Interference pad, but before that, I'm going in with that Hickory Smoke again, being ink blending towards the base where I was heavier with that bundled sage ink, so that I can get a little bit of the interference properties showing up for this. Now I'm using Hickory Smoke for this project because I don't necessarily want it to be super dramatic, but if you want a more dramatic result, you could use black soot or a black dye-based ink, and you would get a lot more of a dramatic look to it. Both of them look fantastic. For this one, I chose to be a little bit more subtle. Once I have that Hickory Smoke on there, once again, I go in with that microfiber cloth, clean off any ink, and then I go in with that Summer Garden Interference. And here is the final result. I always love the look of those interference inks. And when you have the foiled edges to it, they just play off each other really, really well. For my solid hot foiled piece, I'm going to be using it as a mat around my image piece, but I want to play on the lines from those florals. They're going to be showing anyways, so we might as well make them a little bit more prominent and make it look completely intentional. So I went in with my crushed velvet interference pad. It really doesn't matter which pad you use for this. I wanted them to be purple, and I just chose the crushed velvet because the purple was darker than either my Lavender Fields or my shaded Lilac. You're not going to see the interference with this. You're really just going to see the color. So I wanted there to be more contrast because I wanted, like I said before, wanted this to be totally intentional. I'm trimming this down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 inches. I will be trimming it down a little bit more because I changed my mind. When I'm doing it at this point, I have the idea that I'm going to use that interference piece as my mat and then the white piece in the center. I feel afterwards that it needs a little bit more color, so I end up putting a colored mat behind that interference piece. So I do have to trim it down, but I'll get to that then. After all of those were trimmed down, I'm using the coordinating Petal Poetry die set. Like I said before, this works with both the stamp set as well as the press plate set. I am cutting out those images and just setting them to the side. And here's where I decided to add an extra mat just to highlight the purple and really frame it off. So I have some shaded or Lilac Blossom cardstock here. I trimmed that to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. Then took my foiled piece, trimmed that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And then my white piece is 3 7/8 by 5 1/8. I rarely do a double mat on my cards, but for this card, I just think it really suited it. Now, when I'm using interference inks, I will often use one of my interference ink colors to color my mat behind my image to play on and to tie in those interference pads. I chose not to do that for this one simply because I already have that Prism solid hot foiled piece in there, and that, because it's metallic and because it already has the shimmer, I kind of thought it looked better to have a solid piece of cardstock behind it rather than having two that had different shimmers to them. But you could certainly do a shimmer or do one of those interference pads there. It wouldn't ruin it. I just didn't think it was necessary. With my bases glued down and just letting that glue sit, I can put my acrylic block on there. I do this all the time just to hold everything nice and flat, but then it shows me that card base and I can layer and arrange my die cuts to make sure that the design that I have in my head is what the final result will look like, or is what I like. If I want to change it up, this is really easy to do now because I can see exactly how it's going to look on that card base. And the other thing too is I can go and move that to the side and have my design ready to go when I know exactly where everything was placed as I'm gluing it down. I regularly get asked if my glue bottle clogs, and every once in a while it does. I just have a pin on my desk and I just showed that there where I unclog it. Every once in a while though, if it starts to happen a lot, you may need to take the cap off your glue bottle, completely clean it out under running water. When that glue gets a little bit lower in your bottle, there's more airspace there. So sometimes the glue will start to dry right on the inside of the needle or the narrow top. And I just find that by running it underwater, using that pin, you can remove any residue or anything that's causing problems there. As I did my front piece, I had a little piece left over that I didn't want to put on the front because I thought it looked too cluttered, but I didn't necessarily want to save it for a future card. So it's easy to just pop it on the inside of the card and have that extra little bit of detail in there. For the centers of my florals, I added some stickles. They just are Stardust stickles, so you can still see the interference inks with them. But those interference inks are water reactive, so you can see that I had a little bit of color change in the centers of them, and I love how it changed that color just a little bit. For the second card, I'm going to use that press plate again, but this time I'm going to use it in the Better Press system. I have some Better Press cardstock here that I'm taping to the clear top plate, and then I will put my plate onto the Better Press base. I'm also using black Better Press ink. Now this Petal Poetry plate is just slightly bigger than a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of cardstock. So as I'm placing it on my base, you can see exactly where the outside edges of that 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch border is. So I'm making sure to place my pieces so that the parts that are going over top of the edge aren't parts that I want to have on my card, that I don't want visible. Some of those parts, one of the leaves, there's going to be an edge off the leaf. I can easily tuck that under another piece, or the end of a stem. When I tuck it under another piece, you're never going to see it. So by strategically placing it, I can make sure that I'm not missing a piece that I want. If you want the entire thing, then I suggest just using a piece of cardstock that's a little bit bigger. The other thing is I am using Better Press cardstock here because it's a little bit thicker, so you get that pressed image in there. For the technique that I'm doing here, I want that look. I like that look. It's not necessary. If you just want the image of the flowers or the stenciled part of the flowers, you can easily just use regular cardstock if that impression is not necessary for you. But sometimes I just really like seeing that. So I chose to use the Better Press cardstock because it's a little bit thicker, and I will see that. I'm using the same shaded lilac distress ink that I used for the first card, completely covering that entire piece in an even amount. Now this card is colored very similarly to my first card because I wanted a similar look to it. The difference here is I'm using black Better Press ink around the edges, and that image is pressed in a little bit. That first image is foiled, so it's completely flat. I don't have any texture from that plate pressing into the cardstock, as well as the fact that Hammermill cardstock is thinner, so it's not thick enough to have that impression anyways. I think if you used a thicker cardstock with that glimmer system, you would also get a little bit of overfoiling, and that would cause a problem. I'm using, for the second layer, that Hickory Smoke Distress ink, once again putting it in the center of the flowers, as well as a little bit of shading on the petals that go over a little bit. Then using that Lavender Fields interference ink. So on the pieces that are on top of my shaded lilac distress ink, you're going to see purple, but on top of the Hickory Smoke, you're going to see a little bit of that green tone, which works really, really well with foliage and florals. For my third layer here, I'm going to use the Silver Shine metallic ink. This is a Lisa Horton ink. It comes in a 3-pack. There's silver, there's gold, and there's copper. I'm using silver here to add that metallic touch to it, just for something a little bit different. I wanted my inking to be similar to my first card, but also a little bit different. I'm putting silver in each one of these cards. The first card was with the foil. For this one, it's with that metallic ink, and I'm also going to use some silver stickles. I just like adding metallics in different ways and seeing the different look of it. For this particular one, having that silver shine on top of that interference ink creates a little bit of a different look, and I just really loved the final result of it. For my leaves, the first layer of leaves, once again, I'm doing that bundled sage, being a little bit heavier towards the base of the leaf and lighter handed towards the tip of the leaf. Just again, it's one of my favorite ways to add that visual dimension, and I really love the look of it. Just like the first card, my last layer is going to use the Summer Garden interference pad again, going in with that Hickory Smoke, being heavier handed towards the center or the base of those leaves where I already have the heavier layer of that bundled sage. So this is going to show off the interference part of the Summer Garden ink pad. So Summer Garden is green on the lighter or whiter areas, and on the Hickory Smoke Ink, you're going to see a little bit more of that blue interference. It's not going to be very prominent because I'm using that Hickory Smoke. It's going to be a little bit more subtle. If I were to use black soot here, it would be a lot more dramatic and you'd see a lot more of that blue color. Here, when you tilt in the light, you'll see just kind of a hint of it. And I always love when you see just a hint of something, it just makes you look at it a little bit farther just to kind of see if your eyes are seeing things correctly. Here is the finished result, and you can see how just that silver shine for that one layer adds a little bit of a different look. Just like my first foiled image, I'm going to use the coordinating Petal Poetry die set to die cut this out. Anytime I'm die cutting an image, I use some tape to hold it in place. Here I'm using some Best Ever craft tape. You don't need to use a whole lot, and I reuse that tape over and over again until it stops sticking. So a little bit of tape goes a long way when it can be reused over and over again. You can see how easy it is to cut all of these out at once. And I love the fact that the plate as well as the die set cut them out all at once. For those little pieces that didn't get full pressed images, I'm just using my detailed scissors to cut off that leaf that is kind of partially on there. For the other one that had a partial image there, I left it whole. I'm just going to be tucking that whole piece underneath there anyways, so we're never ever going to know, and aside from whoever watches this video. For this card base, I have an A2 card base here, and I have a purple mat from that same Lilac Blossom cardstock that I used in my first card. That is trimmed to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. My Hammermill, or my white piece of cardstock here, is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And I use that same silver shine Lisa Horton pad to just rub around the edges. It's just going to give it a silver edge to it. It's not completely even. When you rub it against those pads, you get a little bit of variation. But for this, I really like that look. I also recently got the refills for those metallic pads, so I'm using the Silver Shine refill, and I'm going to add a little bit of speckle or splatter to my background. So I put the cap on the refill. They come without the cap on them, and it's really easy to put that cap on them. And then put a dot of it on my glass surface, misted it with my Mighty Mister to add some water there, and then I'm using a Yasutomo brush to splatter my background. I'm going to let that completely dry before I go any farther. And while I'm waiting for that to dry anyways, I'm going to use that silver stickles to put in the center of those florals just to really make that center sparkle and to tie in with that silver. Once that's completely dry, I can start to assemble my card. So I can add that white piece with the silver splatter and silver outline to that front and then arrange my pieces. Now I am going to arrange them just slightly different from the first card. I could do the same arrangement as that first card, but I wanted to just give it a little bit of variation. With that large cluster in the center, it's really easy to just pick the extra pieces and just put them going from behind that center wherever you want it to go a little bit farther. And I like the fact that there's some that are a little bit larger, a little bit longer than others to give you a little bit of that variation. For my sentiments for these cards, I'm using some sentiments that were foiled from the Gilded Greetings press plate or hot foil plate and coordinating die set. This is from a previous project. I have a couple left over, or some left over. I will link to that video that I foiled them at the end of this video. This is a larger press plate, so you get a lot of sentiments for it, and it's got a really nice cursive to it, and they're also nice size sentiments, perfect for the fronts of cards. Just like that first card, I put that extra little piece on the inside of my card rather than saving it for a future project. This time I just put it in the top right rather than the bottom left. And I can wait for that to dry just when I'm waiting for the rest of my card front to dry. And it dries really, really quick with that Barely Art glue. My last card is going to use that stamp set, and anytime I have a new stamp set, I like to use a white eraser on the stamping surface and then a brush to brush off any eraser bits. This takes off any manufacturing residue that might be there, and it makes that stamp take the ink a little bit better. Rather than testing my stamp first and making sure that it's going to take ink, I just do this with every stamp set, knowing that if I've used even one stamp from the set, the entire set is totally done. For this card, I could do the same as what I've done for my previous cards and die cut all my pieces and layer them on the front, but I thought it would be fun to just use these stamps and create a floral background. So I'm putting them around my watercolor cardstock here, using it in the center of my waffle flower grip mat that is in my Misty stamping tool. It really needs to be washed. You can see that it's not holding the cardstock really well because it does need to be washed. So I'm using my magnets. Then putting some embossing powder tool on there to make sure that that embossing powder is only going to stick to my Versamark ink. I am inking and stamping my stamp twice to make sure that I have a full and crisp image. And I'm also using a stamp pressure tool just to make sure to press down on that stamp to get even pressure all along. For this card, I'm going to emboss with some silver embossing powder. This is how I'm adding the silver to this particular one. Anytime I do watercoloring, I typically like to or prefer to heat emboss my images, and there's two reasons for that. First of all, I just like the look of it. I like the raised edge to it. And in this case, because I'm using some metallic ink, I love that metallic edge. The embossing typically has a shiny finish to it, which gives you a little bit of a different texture from watercoloring. For this particular one, I am going to watercolor with those interference inks. However, I'm going to be fairly light with my watercolor. I want just a soft floral background here. We're not going to see a ton of the shimmer from those interference inks. If I was a little bit heavier handed with the watercolor, you'd see a little bit more. So we're pretty much only going to see the color. You may see a touch of shimmer here and there, but it's going to be mostly for color. I can use the re-inkers for the watercolor here, but I chose to just use the pads. It's really easy to do. I have them already out here. So to use the pads, all I do is press it onto my glass surface. If you don't work on a glass surface, you could do this onto a piece of acetate, onto a plate, onto an acrylic block. So there's different ways to have a palette for this. And then I have my Zig water brush here. This is my favorite brush for watercoloring because the water is in the handle. I have a lighter area and a darker area for the color here because when I pressed my pad down, I was heavier on the top part than I was on the bottom part. So when I start my watercolor, I will start with a light coat with the lighter area of my watercolor, and then I'll go in with the darker area or the heavier area of that ink, and I will just dot in the ink where I want that to be darker. Because those areas are still going to be wet from my first coat, it will automatically start to blend and bleed. If I need to help it along, I will take that piece of paper towel that I have to my right and I will blot my brush to take off any excess ink, and just basically with water, I will blend that color out a little bit. But even as it's drying, it does blend out a little bit. So you have a lot of control here. If you happen to get a little bit too much ink down or a little bit too much color down, you can clean off your brush and just take the clean brush with water and take some of that excess up. You can also take a corner of your paper towel and blot it that way to get some more color up. Watercolor is one of my favorite ways to color a background or to color an image. I just kind of get zen with it. And there's so many different things and different ways you can watercolor, or different products you can watercolor with. By using these interference inks, like I said before, here I'm more going for the color. I want the color of this watercolor to coordinate with the colors of my previous cards. I'm not necessarily being heavy-handed with it to get that interference, but you could, if you wanted, and I've done it before, be heavier with it, get more ink on there, and then you're going to get more of a shimmer finish to your watercolors. So it really depends on the final result that you're going for. Once I have my florals done here, I'm going to clean off that color off my glass surface. And then I'm using the Summer Garden and I'm going to watercolor my leaves. And I'm doing the exact same process. You can see that when I press that Summer Garden interference pad down, I have the top area that's heavier, that's got a lot more ink, and that area that's heavier is also going to have that interference color with it. Where it's lighter at the bottom there, it's more going to have just the dye part. It's not really going to have much of the interference. I'm doing the same process where I am taking the lighter color, covering the entire area, and then I'll go in with the darker color and just dot it or put that color where I want the color to be darker. If it needs help to be blended out, I will blot any color off of my brush or take any excess color off my brush, and I will blend that out as I want. If as it dries, I find that I want more color to it, I can always re-wet that entire area and add more color and control it that way. By having the heat embossing on here, I don't have to worry about what areas I've already watercolored and make sure to stay away from those wet areas. That heat embossing adds a little bit of a ridge, so it gives you more freedom just to color right beside something you've already watercolored in a different color and not worry about it blending and bleeding into each other. For this watercolor, I'm just doing the florals themselves. I'm not watercoloring the background, but you certainly could. I actually considered taking that silver pad and using that for the background, but I just wanted this to, again, be very soft and very light. And I thought if I did that silver on the background, it would just be a little bit too heavy and it would be a little bit more bold than the look that I was going for. Once I have my whole piece here watercolored, I'm going to let this dry completely. Now I use distressed watercolor cardstock here. When you use watercolor cardstock, there's often a side that has some texture to it and one side that's a little bit more flat. There's still a bit of texture, but doesn't have as much as the other side. For watercolor, I will, especially when I'm stamping and then watercoloring, I will typically use the side that is more flat. For two reasons. First of all, you're going to get a better stamped image because you don't have that texture that you're working with. The other thing is when you're watercoloring with that texture, sometimes you get the color settling in the recessed areas of that texture. And by using the more flat side, I don't have that issue. I can have a little bit more control with my watercolor, and I prefer that. Once it's dry, I'm going to trim this down and start to assemble my card. This is a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch piece of watercolor cardstock, and I will typically use a 1/4 sheet and then trim it down once I'm done. Once I'm done, I can kind of judge which area I want to see more of, which area I don't mind trimming a little bit off of. For this particular one, I will trim, say, that top that you see there that has just leaves and not really florals. I'll pick those type of areas to trim off because, in my opinion, they're not quite as interesting as the floral areas. I did blot just a tiny little bit of that silver down to put on the centers of those florals, just to tie in the silver right there. And I'm using that Lilac Blossom cardstock for my mat for this once again. That piece is trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and my watercolor piece is being trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Once that's trimmed down, I can glue that to the front of my card. And once again, I'm going to use one of those foiled sentiments from the Gilded Greetings hot foil plate, the one that I did in a previous video. Here I'm doing Thinking of You. Obviously, with this floral background, you can do any sentiment. Any sentiment would work here. I chose the Thinking of You because it comes in 3 different words, and I thought it would be nice to place that in some of the background open areas. I did keep my sentiment towards the top of this particular card, but you obviously could put it a lot lower if you wanted. I love cards like this because the florals are fairly generic, so you could use this for any occasion. And really, it's nice to have a generic background that doesn't necessarily go for just one occasion. It works for anything. I love how we have that shine from the silver there, and it plays off with that prism foiled sentiment. Even though I watercolored silver in the center of my florals, I wanted to have a little bit of that glitter texture, so I put some Stardust Stickles over top of it. Stardust Stickles doesn't have any color to it, it just has an iridescent shine, so you'll still see the silver underneath there, but it just adds that texture and that sparkle to the center. Then we have the second card here with the better pressed image and those silver stickles in the center. And you can see how having the sparkle from the stickles in the center really adds that shimmery texture and kind of plays off the centers of the flowers. Then we have our foiled one with the interference inks as well. And I love how the center of the flowers with the stickles just changed a different color and highlighted those as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. Have a fantastic day.